Hi, Mike Kennedy. I was looking at knives, more stimulus money. Might spend a little bit of it. So I was just looking at knives. And I saw this video by the gray-bearded Green Beret. He's got a really great channel. Obviously, he was a Green Beret, but he's involved in teaching. He's, I think he's an instructor that's tied in with Dave Canterbury, and just an extremely knowledgeable person. And so he was talking about knives, and he said this was based on 30 months experience when he did this video. He had originally bought the Mora Garber stainless steel, because that's how it came out first. And then when the Garber came out in high carbon steel, he switched to that because there's just a lot of people who are interested in bushcraft and survival who want high carbon steel instead, because it's easier to sharpen in the field and also has the added benefit of being able to start a fire if you have some flint or even maybe quartz to strike the back of the knife with. So, and he shows that in the video. But anyway, so he's going talking, and he says that if you could only bring one knife with him, hands down, definitely it would be this Mora Garber. And I'm sure he has much more expensive knives. And but he said this is the one that he hands down definitely would bring. And he talks about it, everything's great. And then, I see this other video from, what is it, Everyday Tactical Videos or whatever. But I'll put links to both of them below. And this guy he's comparing the Hezbollah from Mora with the Mora Garber. And right off the bat, he says, well, these knives, including the Garber, they aren't survival knives or even bushcraft knives. They're too small. They just aren't. They're good for like camp knives, but they're not bushcraft knives or survival knives. And it's like, how can you get so varied a statement from two people who probably know what they're talking about? And it's the idea of the philosophy you have behind knives and cutting tools, either for bushcraft or survival. In a more traditional sense, and still believed in many other countries, especially like Sweden, where Mora comes from, and they have a lot of woodland and everything like that, is the idea that you have a multi-cutting tool philosophy. In other words, you're going to generally, as the people in the early frontier days of America, you're going to have a very small knife with some type of, and that might have been some type of pen knife or what we would call a jackknife, folding knife, and but small. Then you'd have your knife, the knife we're talking about, and it might have just, for early people, it might have just been a crude butcher knife. And then you'd actually have an axe or a hatchet or smaller axe, depending on whether the person was walking, and I suppose how big the person was, or whether they had some other means like a horse to get around with, and then they would probably carry an axe. So the philosophy in Sweden and different places is you want the knife to be the best knife it possibly can be. You don't want it to be partially an axe and or partially this or that. You want it to be the best thing it can actually be. And of course you have these other cutting tools. And then, like is expressed in the this other video, is you have the philosophy that's more modern, and I don't know if it's particular to I don't think it's just particular to America either, but the idea with survival, if you want to have a survival knife, it has to do more than just a regular knife would do. So therefore, it's longer, it's bigger, it's a lot heavier, because you want the option of being able to chop with it. You want the option of being able to baton wood with it. And it's interesting that the Green Beret guy says that he doesn't baton wood. You know, he might softwood, and he says if if the wood's too hard that he's trying to, if he's trying to split some wood with the knife, and it's too hard, he just goes and finds another piece of wood, because the softwood is going to make better kindling anyway. So why would you do that? And a lot of people have this anti-batoning philosophy, and he's not completely that, but it's something he doesn't do a lot, because beating on your knife just isn't something that a lot of people who are, into knives and this philosophy would do. They're going to keep their knife. They're going to protect their knife. They're not going to do absurd things with it, because, it's an important resource when they're out, whether it's bushcraft or survival, and they're just not going to abuse it because they may need it later. But then we go over to this other philosophy of the survival thing. We need the knife to do everything. So, and even sometimes the knives can start taking on this weirder configuration, and you'll see some knives, survival knives, that actually are starting to turn into a hatchet. In other words, instead of having a blade like this, they flare out and have some, end on them, or sometimes it's quite a bit closer to the handle than what you would see with an axe or anything. But it actually has, it's starting to become, an axe. And so I guess, again, here's the philosophy of it, is that in the survival scenario that people are thinking of here, for some reason you only have that one thing and you don't have anything else. Now, in more of the philosophy, like I say, of the 10 C's, the more traditional bushcrafting and things like that, or preparedness, that you would have things with you, other things with you, and that would be the smaller cutting tool and this axe or something else. Now, the axe is often replaced with something like a buck saw, and then more popular, you see on videos by people who do a lot of things like this, the idea of a folding saw, and a lot of times it's going to be a silky saw. If you watch Survival Russia, this Lars uses these silky saws extensively, and but when he goes out, he has all the things he needs with him. If he's going out on the snow, it's very common that he sometimes when he goes out, he'll be pulling a sled with all of his stuff in it. Then he's got the larger tent dwelling, maybe, or he's got an axe. He's got all these different things with him, and so it buys more into that philosophy of that especially when you're out bushcrafting. In other words, you made an intentional step into this environment that you would actually have the right tools for the right job. In other words, you wouldn't be out there and kind of be compromised by saying, well, I'm going to go spend 3-4 days in the woods, and you brought along this kind of, monster survival knife that, you can do some chopping with it, but it's not going to be as good as an axe or a buck saw or a folding saw, and it's not going to be as good for doing small chores too. So a lot of times what I see now, that as people, things kind of evolve, and people were into more of a traditional bushcrafting. We're trying to, more emulate what the settlers did, or early people in different countries. And really now it seems like, of course you're not, because we have these fantastic materials, the metals and the knives, that they couldn't even dream of, because the types of steel and things we have just weren't around, and the technology. And now we can buy these knives that are unbelievably good. We can change what they're made of and different things like that, and they probably didn't have those choices at all, I know they didn't. But so now seeing the idea of a bushcraft type thing, a lot of times you'll see the multi-tool replace the small knife. you'll see this mid-sized knife that might be something like the Mora Garber, or maybe it's a little bit larger, and then you see the idea of having this folding saw, or if someone's more traditional and or just someone who can carry more weight with them have decided to, they'll actually have an axe with them. And it's kind of interesting because then when you look at survival, with axes and things like that, and they had a product they were selling, but the idea was they were saying that axes are really dangerous for people to use occasionally. People get hurt on them, people get cut on them. One of the seasons alone, one of the contestants was carrying his, and he was kind of going kind of fast. He wanted to get this thing done quick, and he's carrying his axe with him, and it hasn't got a covering over the blade, and he's doing this. You're thinking to yourself, uh-oh, and sure enough, he ends up cutting himself badly, and he has to go to the competition. So using an axe just occasionally can actually be dangerous. I watched this one, and I don't have a link to this, but it looked like it was produced in the 50s, black and white, like a half-hour show, and you've got this, you've got the kind of a typical host-type person or announcer-type person, and he's paired up with this First Nation. They're in Canada, so you wouldn't say Native America. They're First Nation, that you would call them there, or specifically, if you knew what tribe they belonged to, you would use that. But so this, and he's a large, rugged guy. He has an axe, and only an axe. He doesn't have anything else. He doesn't have a knife with him or anything. But he's going to survive all his survival with this axe. And sure enough, he does the friction fire. He builds the friction fire set with it. He even goes so far as to, they need some cordage, so he digs up and uses spruce roots, these thin spruce roots, and he splits them with an axe. He's sitting there with the axe, and so with a high level of skill, you can use the axe for a lot of things, including very small chores you normally wouldn't. But like I say, this man, he had an unbelievably high degree of skill with this axe. He could just do all kinds of things with it. But normally, unless you're really spending a lot of time doing that, you probably wouldn't. And I know for that reason, a lot of survival type people will say that a folding saw they believe is safer. And even you can hurt yourself with a saw too, but the chances are less likely, and it's easier to follow safety guidelines, I think, with a saw than it is with an axe. So basically, you get down to these two things. How realistic is it going to be that you're caught in a situation like on TV? You get dropped in the middle of the woods and you only have your knife. Then probably you're going to want your knife to do everything. But more often than not, certainly with bushcraft, you're going out into the environment. You're making a conscious choice. So it would seem to me that you would have the tools you need that were optimized for their uses, unless, again, you're severely limited in what you can carry. And I forget which one it is, whether it was Nesmith or Kephart, but one of them was fairly small. So the idea of the pack he carried was really small, and ultralight hadn't been invented then. It wasn't ultralight, but it was light. In other words, he was a smaller person, and so he didn't carry a lot of weight with him, which only, usually they say a pack should be a certain percentage of your body weight at a maximum. But, of course, that depends on a lot of other factors, too. But anyway, it was just kind of interesting to hear these two opinions, and the idea of having a knife that kind of does a bunch of things but might not do those individual tasks well, but it does do them, as opposed to the idea of having, maybe 3 cutting tools, and then each one does its job extremely well. And to me, it would seem for bushcraft, this other option would definitely be the way to go. And then for survival, you do have some choices, but again, if you're in the case where, you're a hiker and all these different things, and you're in a woodland area, and it's far away from civilization, out of cell phone range and all these things like that. It would make sense to me that you would buy more into the 10C philosophy of Dave Canterbury of having, and you would say these other people, a survival kit, but having these things with you and knowing how to use them, and you would probably have some of those other cutting tools. But I just found it was interesting because of the two philosophies, and is how likely it is, are you going to just have a knife with you? And it's kind of funny sometimes, I think amusing, when someone's saying, well, we're in this situation, and they pull out a $300 knife. And it's like, well, gee, if you had a $300 knife with you, why don't you have a Bic lighter in your pocket to start the fire instead of friction fire? And I'm not saying you don't. That isn't a valuable skill to learn, but I think no person kind of in their right mind that is really interested in survival wouldn't have some other fire starting options, which would probably be a Bic lighter, a ferrocerium rod, and maybe some storm matches and things. And have the option to make that friction fire, but my goodness, depending on where you are and the materials you can find, that even really skilled people may take an enormous amount of time, effort, and calories that you can't afford to waste in a survival situation to effectively get that first fire, or maybe not get it at all. I know, watching the first two seasons of Dual Survivor, which were really good, there was one situation where everything was too wet and Cody just couldn't start a fire, and any other time he tried to start one, he had no problem, but everything was just too wet in this situation. So what do you think? Would you think this Mora Garber knife is a survival knife or bushcraft knife? Would you go with this philosophy of having these different cutting tools with you? Or would you go with the option of having this really, really big knife, or that's starting to become an axe? Is that what you would have with you? And saying that, well, that's easy to carry, I'm going to have that with me, so I'm out hunting, well, I'm just going to have that knife with me rather than have some of these other things. Tell me what you think. Bye.